wasn't going to inflict you with my singing voice. My speaking voice is bad enough, I'm sure. Look, it's a real pleasure to be here. Heather, thank you so much for the welcome. It was when we chose this day because today is the birthday of Private, now is it Wynnum? Guinan. There we go. So, born 118 years ago. And I was just looking through our paperwork today, and the letter that John sent to the embassy was written on the 20th of August last year. So it's this journey of sort of, for the family has taken sort of a year. And just to give you a sort of bit of background, it was sort of more about, trying to provide a gravestone for him back in Western Australia. And that was sort of going on, and my colleague Therese in the embassy was sort of looking after this because the ambassador was going back to Australia and was going to bring it on. And at the same time, I was sort of doing a bit of research on a bunch of Australian and Irish sort of soldiers that had served in the Australian infantry during World War I. Because there's about 30 or so graves all scattered around Ireland. And I was very interested in sort of looking this up. And when Therese had mentioned this, I kind of sort of said, oh, that's really interesting. Took the letter from her desk and started to read it and go, okay, Therese, I'll look after this. Just because of my sort of background in history. And it was interesting, in that letter that John had sent, it said that, look, here was this service number and he may have been entitled to a medal. Could we give any information? Having sort of done a lot of sort of this research, I then contacted our colonel in London who's responsible for defence relations here with Ireland, and she had a friend in Sydney who also was a historian, and they looked into this and came back and said, look, actually he's entitled to 6 medals because he served during a period of great importance to Australia and in a theatre of war which is little known. It's probably especially here in Ireland and New Guinea, but for us in Australia it is right on our doorstep. New Guinea is our closest neighbour. If you think sort of the coastline right up the tip, it's right at the top of sort of Queensland. And the Japanese had invaded New Guinea, and it was a real sort of threat to Australia at that time. We were worried about being invaded and taken over by the Japanese. And James had enlisted in the works companies. Now, to give you sort of a bit of background on these, during the Second World War, the Australian Army established 39 employment companies, totalling by war's end by about 15,000 men. While the name of these army units occasionally varied, the Employment Company, Labour Company, Works Company, Labour Unit, Labour Corps, their function did not. They were established to ensure that the Australian Defence Force had a large group of soldiers dedicated to a central labouring task, the hard physical labour needed to maintain the war effort and supporting the fighting forces. Now, of these companies, many were in part made up of what we call aliens, or non-British citizens. Now I say non-British citizens because at the time, if you're an Australian, you're considered a British citizen. Now these companies were not armed. They were soldiers without guns. They worked on trains, loading of cargo, providing foodstuffs, doing all that essential labour to enable the soldiers to be fighting on the front lines. Now he served in New Guinea. 5 Australian divisions were employed in New Guinea, as were a great part of our Navy and our Air Force. Today, this contribution has largely been overshadowed, like most aspects of our history, by the dominance of Gallipoli and Kokoda. Beyond the scale of these large operations there, however, the New Guinea offensive is also significant as it produced the war's closest and most successful cooperation between Australian diggers and American GIs. Experiences in New Guinea were diverse. Operations were conducted over vast and remote areas. The terrain and climate were tough and exhausting and were as much as an enemy as the Japanese. Now, personnel of the employment companies, both on the mainland and New Guinea, served their country well, but they served it in a most unspectacular role and recognised by the Commander-in-Chief. He said, often these roles were carried out in very most strenuous work without which the many arms of the forces could not properly function. Their duties are such that a continuous maintenance of a high standard of esprit de corps is necessary to offset the sometimes monotonous nature of the tasks allotted to them, and this is borne out by the willingness and conscientiousness with which these tasks are performed. The Commander-in-Chief therefore desires that his appreciation of the services being rendered by these personnel be conveyed to all ranks. Now, a lot of these soldiers were not sort of eligible for active service. In James's case, he had a hearing defect, and so he would not be eligible to serve on the front line. There were many other sort of nationalities, from Axis countries, from Germany, from Italy. There were many companies that were actually full of Chinese sort of soldiers. And a lot of these weren't recognised for the great contribution that they had. Their companies' names were renamed from just being works companies and employment companies to the Australian Work Companies to recognise their contribution to Australia. Now, there was one sort of quote by a former member of one of these companies which I thought was quite sort of apt. He said, we were a unique unit, though at the time we didn't know it. Such a mixture of different nationalities. If only the world could realise that people with different cultures and habits and languages can live together as we did. Now, among these people, there were many that returned back to their countries. Many travelled to new lands, but most settled in Australia, like James. He became a legal citizen, built families and careers, and mourned the loved ones that fascism destroyed. There's many that we celebrate, signed